Hey everybody, Ryan Wieber here to talk to you about a new and arguably improved method for creating lightsaber glows in Adobe After Effects. Let's jump right in. I've got my footage layer here, which is actually just an image I found off of Google, but it's the correct pixel size and duration for the composition. First thing we're going to do is create a new solid, set it to black, and make sure it's the composition size. Then place it underneath your footage, and then do the same thing again. New solid, white, underneath the footage. And this is actually going to be our roto layer and a black background layer, which we're not really going to do anything else to. You could lock it if you wanted to, but I won't bother to. And with the roto layer here selected, hit the pen tool, zoom on in, and roto away. And this is nice because we didn't have to do any open any layer windows. We're not going to have to copy any mask keyframes, stuff like that. We can actually draw what appears to be right on the footage layer, and that's because the footage layer is, of course, visible on top of this. If we were to turn it off, we would see the very familiar white saber core on a black background. Also, at this point, we're actually going to set the footage layer to screen so we can see through to see everything we're doing. We're actually going to have the footage layer on top of everything that we're going to do to create the lightsabers, which is different from previous methods. And the way it works is essentially that additive layers, it's not particularly relevant which is on top and which is on bottom, especially with screen where the math is very straightforward. It's they're adding together in a way that similarly to lightsabers, the way it doesn't really matter which is on top. They're both being additively applied to each other, and it doesn't really matter which is on top. And so, that being the case, organizationally with this method, I found it just easier to keep the footage on top, and then the transfer mode of that footage is what would traditionally be the transfer mode of your saber. And we'll get into that a little bit later. So for now, let's actually create our saber effect. As it is, we've got our mat here ready to be used, and now we're going to use some wonderful little things called adjustment layers. And to be honest, I didn't know a whole lot about them until fairly recently. The way adjustment layers work is they affect everything underneath them as if it was a layer that you're applying a filter on or something. So, for example, we can go ahead and apply a fast blur. You could do Gaussian blur if you want. I find fast blur looks 95% as good and is, in fact, faster. Repeat edge pixels always do. If you notice that your glows are sort of fading out as they approach the edge of frame, it's probably because you don't have repeat edge pixels on. And it just takes the pixels that are on the edge here and sort of theoretically extends them on beyond the frame, and so the blur will continue on as if the saber continues out of frame and makes for a very realistic look. This is just going to be the core of our saber, so we're just going to give it a blur of 1. Depending on how close your core is to the screen, you might get up higher into 2, 3, or 4, or if it's very far away, maybe 0.5, but 1 is most of the time what you're going to want to use. So we're going to duplicate this adjustment layer and create all of our glow layers, and if you watch carefully, you'll notice that I close that, click away, and then click the layer again. And that's because if I had simply gone and done edit duplicate, I would have actually duplicated the effect and not the layer, which is what we want to do. So make sure you have the layer selected, not the effect, when you go and duplicate. So back into effects controls for this new adjustment layer we just made, and this is going to be our first glow layer. Let's make it 10. Uh-oh, what happened? We do not have a core now. Well, that's because adjustment layers, like I said, they affect everything underneath them, including the nice core that we had drawn. So what do? We can set it to a transfer mode, which is a cool feature of adjustment layers, and as soon as you do set it to a transfer mode, it assumes that you want to see everything underneath it, and then just take everything that's underneath it and then apply your effect to it and apply it to all those layers in whatever transfer mode you want, which works nicely for us. We're going to be using screen here. Click away, click again, duplicate, or Control D, of course, effects controls, or F3, and then we're going to double that, which will be 20. We'll duplicate that again, effects controls 40. Each time, just double the fast blur value, 10, 20, 40, 5, 10, 20, 40, etc., etc. In fact, I'm going to duplicate it one more time and set that one up to 80, which might seem a little excessive, and it will slow down the render a bit, but when you really got very flat backgrounds like this, where you really see the gradation of the glow here, an extra layer that's really big but will have a low opacity, which we'll get to in a quick second, can really make a lot of difference in sort of the subtlety of the glow's fall off. So now we've got these screen layers, which are the glow layers, and the first one I'm going to leave at 100%, but for the other ones I like to do sort of a linear drop off in opacity, because as you can see right now it's looks pretty darn bright, and that's partly because the adjustment layers are a little differently from past methods, because they take the blurs underneath them. Like, for instance, this blur is actually taking all of these blurs and blurring that, as opposed to simply the core, and so it ends up being a lot brighter. But when we do this opacity fall off thing, it counteracts it pretty nicely. So I'm going to do this one down to 75%, the one above it down to 50%, and the last one, I think you can guess that it would be 47%. No, 25, obviously. And now we've got something that looks a lot more like what we'd expect, what we'd like to see. The only thing left is, of course, the colorizing. So let's create a one more adjustment layer underneath the footage. The transfer mode is going to stay in normal for this one. And adjust color balance. I always preserve luminosity. I encourage you to. I also encourage you not to really tinker with the shadows. I find they only create for a more bogus, fake-looking effect, because it starts to sort of get weird, flat, darkened areas in your glows. So if you have to, you know, obviously do what you got to do. I mean, everything here is for you to tweak and experiment with, but generally I never touch the shadows. So this saber will set to a blue color for reasons I'll leave up to you to figure out. And I always throw some green into my blues just to get that nice cyany looking blue. And now I've got what looks to be a complete saber. If you're just doing one saber, you're pretty much done, and it's all here in one composition for you, and it's actually very easy to go back and tweak if you ever wanted to. You can just turn off all these layers, which are, well, not these two, doing all the effects for you. Click the roto layer and go ahead and tweak, or even turn that one off if you want to see just the footage. In fact, if you were so inclined, you could actually leave all of these on, and if your machine won't choke to death on you, you can go ahead and tweak your fully rendering on the fly glowing saber effect. The other thing is, if you wanted to add another saber into this shot, you couldn't do it in one composition. You'd have to create a new one for it, and I'll go ahead and demonstrate that for you. You can take the composition that you have here, because you've already done all the work in setting up the glows and the color balance, and just duplicate it. And then in the new composition, you would take your roto layer here and just you know, rotoscope the other saber that would be in the shot, which is obviously not in this picture, but we'll pretend that there is one behind his shoulder for some reason. Change the effect controls on the color balance layer. Let's just say that the saber is going to be red. And then because you don't want the footage layer to be brought into the first composition again, either turn it off, or if you have After Effects 6.5, you can right click and set it to a guide layer, which basically makes it not render. And so you can see it here, but if you were to render this composition right now, you would only get the saber. Likewise, when you bring it into the first comp, which is what you would want to do, the footage layer will not be there. And then you can simply set it to the transfer mode you want. And like I mentioned earlier, the transfer mode of the footage layer, or the comp that you brought in, is the transfer mode essentially for your saber. So if you've got a dark background, you think you can get away with it, you might want to try setting it to add. Doesn't particularly look good in this case. Or maybe lighten. No, that looks like ILM. We'll leave it on screen. And there we have it. A couple of sabers rendering nicely with some fine-looking glows, and very easy to set up, very easy to go back and tweak. It's pretty straightforward workflow. The other thing I would recommend is that by default After Effects' bits per channel is set to 8, and if you go into File, let's see, Project Settings. Where's Project Settings? There we go. And set it to 16 bits per channel, you're giving After Effects a wider color space to work in, and it will take a little longer to render and things like that, but you're essentially giving it more colors to play with. And if you ever notice when you're rendering in 8 bits per channel that you get sort of a weird sort of stair-steppy action with the color here. As it goes down, you can see little sort of concentric circles around your glow. That's because it doesn't have enough color to really smooth that out into a nice soft fall off. And especially over dark and flat backgrounds, it can definitely make a difference to pop it into a 16-bit mode and let it work that way. Even though when you render down to, for instance, digital video, it doesn't have the color space to handle it. When it encodes it down into that lower color space, it'll do it more naturally, as if it were something that was in camera and recorded by you know, the camera's codecs and stuff like that. And so it can make that look a lot more realistic. And so I think that about does it. Hopefully you can take this method and play with it, experiment, tweak, and get results that you really like with hopefully a more improved and easier workflow.